Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our Aussie Aliens and Unidentified Aerial Phenomena series. In this episode, we take a look at Peter Khoury's encounter. Who or what came into his home one night? What did they want from Peter? And did they get it? Peter Khoury looked like any other Australian, working in the construction industry, having a family, having close friends. He was a normal Aussie bloke, migrated to the Sydney area in 1973. Although he was born in Lebanon and spent his early years there, he grew up pretty much in Australia and finished his schooling here in Sydney. He was much like many of the other Australians that I grew up with in the 80s. But that's from the outset. On the inside, Peter had a story, well, it was his reality, that was much different from, well, anyone I know. And this is his story. Peter Khoury, at 23 years old, had an encounter, more than one encounter, that would change his life forever. He lived in the inner west of Sydney, but this wasn't where it all began. You see, the Khoury family were experiencing things as early as when Peter was first born. Back in Lebanon, in Chekka, where they came from originally, there was a strange encounter when Peter was only 22 days old. His mother was said to have been up late with him, nursing him, and quite tired at the time. But she noticed at the window of their home a blonde-haired man with a long, pale face looking back at her and Peter through the window. It was 1964. And they were living in the port town of Chekka. It was quite odd to see a blonde man in town, let alone at night time at someone's window. He was wearing a black turtleneck skivvy, and it was very strange that he'd ventured to their house. She spoke to her family about what happened, and they wrote it off as possibly that he was a sailor from the ports and had just accidentally wandered around past their house. But they didn't think a lot about it afterwards. Well, not for a little while anyway. Peter himself experienced a strange event in 1971. He was 7 at the time and playing with other children, including those from his own family. They made their way onto a neighbour's rooftop, a flat area that they would normally play in. As they reached the heavy door onto the roof and pushed it open, Peter could see his cousin stopped in her tracks. As he looked up, he could see the other children so still, frozen like statues, looking up at what Peter thought must have been a helicopter. It was round, and he could see 2 things inside. It looked like people. He thought he could even touch it if he was to extend his hand. That's how close it was, hovering above the children. The next thing they knew, they were on ground level. The other children couldn't remember what had happened. Only Peter knew. Well, up until he blacked out anyway. He described it as being an egg-shaped craft. He told his family, but they all just wrote it off as possibly another flying plate that they'd seen a few of. It was not uncommon for them to see flying things in the air. They called them flying plates, and they believed that it was just something that the Israelis were doing or involved in. They moved to Australia in 1973, and Peter settled in to the Australian life. Although not long after they moved in, Peter's mother witnessed another strange happening. She noticed a man walking through their home, and she got up to follow as he went into a room. But when she got to the room, nobody was there. She had all of the men looking through the house, Peter, his brothers, their father, trying to find the intruder, but nobody was there. After the thorough search, put it down to it being maybe a ghost, and he became quite a family legend, this ghost. Now it seems a couple of years after this, Peter moves out from home, and there isn't anything in the next couple of years up until 1988, when he moves back into the family home after a rather wild time. For 2 weeks, in the winter of 1988, they heard strange noises outside. The family would get up and investigate, but could never find anything to account for all the noise. Peter remembered the noise as being like heavy boots, or many heavy boots and men walking around outside on their driveway. The noise seemed to go into the garage, which had a locked door. It was quite strange, and Peter would then hear the noise afterwards. But this time, being on his bed, he became paralysed. Where he was laying on his bed faced the window, and he could see the silhouette of a man, which seemed very odd to Peter, as his bedroom window was 8 feet above the driveway. For the man to have been standing at his window in that position, he would have had to have been floating in the air, or an extremely tall person. Perhaps a tall white or a tall Nordic. As for the noises of feet, who knows what that was. After the silhouette disappeared and the noise stopped, Peter was able to move. How strange. Something was definitely going on at the Khoury residence, but it was about to get stranger. Peter had thought he'd lived a wild life for the 6 years that he wasn't living at home, only to move back into the home and 6 months later have all of this strange stuff happen. If Peter was looking for a normal life, he wasn't going to find it back at the parents' home. He reunited with his high school sweetheart, a Greek girl by the name of Vivian. He was doing his best to patch up his life after those wild 6 years. It was strange, he and Vivian had also had a weird encounter together. In the February of 1988, near the Cooks River in the suburb of Hurlston Park, for around 20 minutes, Peter and Vivian witnessed a strange light moving quite erratically. It would seem to flash and then beam across like a shooting star and appear somewhere else. The couple found it most amusing, but didn't think too much about it after that. One night, July 12th, 1988, it was around 11 p.m. He was watching television with his father, when his older brother Sam wanted to watch TV. He came out, he'd been sleeping in Peter's room, and wanted to sit in his favourite chair. So Peter had to get up and move. He ended up going back to his room, while Sam and the father continued watching TV. Almost immediately, as Peter lay down, he began to feel a strange numbness, a tingling in his legs, which began crawling up his body. He thought it must have had something to do with the wild life he'd had for the last 6 years, and he thought he was going to die. He was completely paralysed, although at this point he must have forgotten that only a few weeks before he'd been paralysed when he heard those noises outside the house and saw the silhouette of the man at the window. Like many of these abductions, sometimes things don't come back all of a sudden. They take time to come back over years. As it was happening, Peter felt like he was going to die. The fear was incredible, but it upped a level when these creatures, dark hooded creatures, 3 to 4 foot tall, came into the room and stood beside the bed. He could only move his eyes now, and as he looks to his left, he sees 2 different types of beings, tall and gold yellowish colour, with narrow pointed chins and big black eyes. He sensed one was male and the other female, although They looked the same to him, with small slit mouths. They had Band-Aid-sized masks with them. The female, he believed, had the mask on and the male did not. Peter remembers hearing telepathically, probably from the male one without the mask on, that he need not worry, he wouldn't be harmed, and to relax. He was amazed at how soon after he heard this that he felt calm, no fear. He felt as though the tall masked beings were doctors, as they wore white gowns or coats. The one closest to him spoke again. Not to worry, it would be like the last time. Last time? Peter says he saw all the emotion in the eyes of these beings. He could feel the emotion through those eyes, like they were smiling. And he saw the look of compassion, which he felt was similar to that of how a mother would look at her child, most lovingly. He describes the small beings, creatures, as having dark features and big lips, but does not say much more about those entities. The tall being nearest to him had a long needle-like flexible crystal tube in its hands. He pointed it to the top of Peter's head, and Peter felt the tip go inside, but no pain. Then he blacked out. When Peter became conscious again, he looked around the room to make sure there was no one there, and he jumped up and ran out to his brother and father in the lounge room. They were both asleep. He woke his brother and asked him how long he'd been out of the room. The brother said about 10 minutes. He was confused as to why he and his father were both asleep. They looked around the room, and on the television it was station close, which meant that the program that the father and the brother Sam had been watching was now ended, and they'd only just started a program, they said. They had lost time, about 2.5 to 3 hours or so. And it was strange, as Sam said, that he's a light sleeper. He doesn't normally just nod off like that. And to nod off as soon as Peter left the room, something had definitely happened. And Peter knew exactly what had happened. He explained the whole thing to his father and Sam, his older brother. They were a bit sceptical at first, but believed Peter in the end. They couldn't account for any other reason why things had happened. They hadn't seen these beings, but they were out cold, and they couldn't understand how or why that had happened. They were all quite shaken up about what had happened. The next day, Peter told his fiancée Vivian what had happened. He noticed a puncture mark on his shin also. She checked his head for where the being had placed this crystal tube, and it had gone in. She found a bit of dry blood, and the area was quite tender. Peter went to his doctor to get it checked out, but the doctor couldn't see anything wrong, only that there might have been a little lump there. He did not believe Peter's story, saying that it was most likely he'd bumped his head at work, maybe on a nail or something. Peter told the rest of his family, cousins and aunts and the extended family, but nobody really believed that it was alien beings that had come. One suggested that it may have been Saint Charbel, Lebanon's first officially recognised saint, and Vivian's family weren't a lot of help or comfort either. They had their own beliefs. Nobody really believed it could be aliens, except for possibly Peter's brother Sam, the father, the mother, their immediate family, and of course Vivian believed him too. She'd seen UFOs with him before. Something around Peter was very strange. He decided it was best just to go on with his life, if he could. A few months later, Peter and Vivian passed a large billboard featuring Whitley Strieber's new book, Communion. He had only just released it. Peter was shocked at the image, how similar The face of the being on Whitley Strieber's book matched that of the beings that were in his room on that night. As soon as the book was available, Peter bought it. Vivian read the book first and was surprised at how similar the encounter Peter had had that night was to what Whitley Strieber had also encountered. There were a lot of other things that were different, but so many coincidences it was uncanny. Now, Whitley Strieber's book of a real encounter, not a fictional one, must have been refreshing to Peter, given that anyone who usually spoke out about these things were ridiculed, and I'm sure Whitley had his fair share of ridicule as well. But it must have been some comfort to Peter that someone out there was coming out around the same time that he was having funny things going on, and similar beings. Anyone that Peter had spoken to, doctors, psychologists, even a UFO group that he'd joined, some had reservations as to what Peter was saying, so he kept a lot to himself. It's strange that Australia seems a bit slower with its acceptance and understanding of such encounters as perhaps other areas in the world. And funnily enough, the man that started the UFO groups off in Australia, Edgar Gerald, he started off Australian Flying Saucer Bureau back in 1953, and he did it from his headquarters in Fairfield. What are the odds, where I grew up? Which is only a 30-minute drive from around the area that Peter Khoury was living when this all went down. Bill Chekka had been involved with some of the UFO groups in Sydney and heard of Peter when he joined around 1991. Peter longed to find out what his encounter meant and the other encounters that his family had witnessed. Perhaps in Peter's eagerness to come out to people, it attracted some unwanted attention. Some may have been jealous that they didn't have such encounters, and others just didn't like it. In the May of 1992, Peter was attacked on a construction site by 3 men with shovels, badly injuring Peter in the head area. He was in severe pain and had continuous bouts of vomiting. Doctors had him on Panadine Fort, a strong painkiller in Australia, and Valium to relax him somewhat. He opted off the Valium after reading up a bit about it. He didn't want that in his system, and just went with Voltaren and the Panadine Fort. A few days before he was due to have a scan on his brain and head, he felt the area where that crystal tube had been inserted by the Extra Terrestrials. He could still feel a lump where it had touched him those 4 years ago. But now, after the beating, he could feel something else, a kind of wire sticking out from his head. He was bothered by it. He told Vivian to look for it, and he himself inspected the area, but they couldn't see anything. He could feel it with his finger and begin to start scratching the area as it annoyed him or bothered him somewhat. And as he scratched and irritated the area, a little piece flicked out and flung into the air. Hitting the coffee table as it fell, it made a noise. But unfortunately it fell in the shag rug or carpet that Peter had had. And despite efforts to try and recover this piece of wire, they could not find it in this shag rug, even going as far as vacuuming up the carpet with a tissue in front of the vacuum part. It didn't help. They couldn't find that piece. And he went on to have the scan done, and the doctor found nothing. Perhaps if he hadn't have scratched it and it hadn't have come out, the doctor may have been able to pick up on whatever that thing was in his head, and it may have been further proof of what happened. Although, having said that, Peter would not need much proof any longer for what was about to happen to him. Another encounter. Oh no, Peter's story isn't over yet. It's far from over. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when I'm putting up part 2 with Peter Khoury's further encounter, one that blows the others out of the water. Stay tuned.